Beneath the museum in Oxford, in a climate-controlled vault where temperature and light are kept in careful balance, there rests a clay prism no larger than a wine bottle. Its surface is packed with wedge-shaped impressions, thousands of them pressed into soft clay nearly 4,000 years ago and then hardened by time. It is known by a catalog number. Most scholars call it the Weld-Blundell prism. It weighs only a few kilograms. In the hand, it would not seem like much. A modest object, a small thing, fired mud geometry silence. And yet the weight of what it says is harder to measure. The prism records the rulers of ancient Sumer. It names kings, the cities they ruled, the order in which dynasties rose and fell, and the length of each reign. At first glance, it appears to be what so many ancient records are: administrative procedural, concerned with sequence custody legitimacy. A record of who ruled where and for how long. But every translator who lingers over the opening lines reaches the same threshold, the same strange sentence, the same quiet shock. Because the text does not begin with a human explanation for government, or a story of tribal strength, or a tale of conquest. It begins with a declaration offered without apology, without argument, without any sign that the scribe expected resistance. When kingship descended from heaven, not arose, not evolved, not was invented, not was seized, descended, as if kingship were a thing, as if it could be transferred, as if it could move from one realm to another, from one city to another, from one family to another, the way grain moves from storehouse to storehouse, or boundary markers move from one parcel of land to the next. The line is so calm that its strangeness deepens. The text does not defend the claim. It does not persuade. It records. It sounds less like theology than administration, less like myth in performance than memory in filing form. That is part of what gives it its peculiar power. The scribe writes as though everyone already knew this, as though the origin of rule was not a matter of debate at all. Then come the names. Alulim of Eridu, Alalgar after him. Rulers whose reigns stretch across spans no modern historian would read literally. Tens of thousands of years. 8 kings before the flood. Then the flood sweeps over the land. Then kingship descends from heaven again. A second time. To new cities, to new rulers. The list continues, and already the old questions begin to gather. What did the Sumerians think they were preserving here? What did they imagine had come down from heaven? An idea, an office, a procedure, a law, a quality lodged in certain families, a capacity that could be recognized, transmitted, preserved. The tablets are real. The museums hold them. The translations are not rumor. What remains uncertain is not whether the documents exist, but what the people who wrote them thought they were doing when they pressed these words into clay. If you listen to the sentence slowly, it does not behave like ornament. It behaves like record. When kingship descended from heaven. And that difference matters. Because if they meant it administratively, if they meant it procedurally, then they were not saying simply that rulers liked to imagine divine approval. They were saying something narrower, more technical, and in some ways more unsettling. That legitimate authority did not begin with humans. That it arrived, that it was given, that it was received under conditions they believed were real. To sit with that claim, we have to enter the world that produced it. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates, southern Iraq, mud plains, floodwater, reed beds, irrigation channels, the heat of long summers, the uncertainty of rivers that could nourish and destroy with the same indifferent force. Around the 5th millennium, BCE villages in this region became something else. Settlements thickened into cities. Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash. Temples rose, canals were cut, labor was organized at scale. And with that scale came a need not merely to remember, but to record. The first writing did not begin as poetry. It began as accounting. Barley allotments, sheep, labor obligations, inventories, receipts, lists. The earliest tablets are not dreamy or speculative. They are practical. Writing emerged because administration required memory stronger than memory. Because institutions needed records that could survive the death of a witness. This matters. It matters because it tells us something about the kind of people who built this system. They were not careless with documentation. They recorded what needed to be preserved. They wrote what mattered for the functioning of the city, the temple, the estate, the law. So, when that same civilization writes that kingship descended from heaven, the phrase cannot be dismissed too quickly as decorative language. These were people who measured grain, counted livestock, tracked labor, assigned rations, and documented ownership. Their habits of mind were procedural. If they repeatedly described kingship as descending, then whatever else the phrase meant, it belonged inside their framework of order, custody, and transfer. Each Sumerian city belonged to a god. Eridu to Enki, Ur to Nana, Uruk to An, and later Inanna. The city was not imagined as human property in the deepest sense. It was divine property. The ruler governed not as autonomous owner, but as steward-tenant, appointed manager. That too changes the meaning of kingship. A king did not simply rule because he was strong. He ruled because the divine owner of the city had in some recognized way vested him with authority. The office came first. The man received it second. By the time the king list was compiled into the form we now possess, the scribes were already looking backward across centuries. They were arranging the past dynasty after dynasty, city after city, trying to set rule in sequence. It is one of the earliest great acts of historical ordering. And at its foundation lies that line, calm and unyielding, returning like a bell note before and after catastrophe. Kingship descended from heaven. Then the flood. Then kingship descended from heaven again. The sentence waits there for us. It does not force belief. It asks for attention. And the deeper we go into the world that wrote it, the less easy it becomes to wave it away. Because the Sumerians were not careless about institutions. They were not vague about offices. They were not indifferent to procedure. If they spoke of kingship as something given, moved, restored, and documented, then perhaps the question is not whether they were naive enough to believe it. Perhaps the question is whether we have learned to hear what they thought they were saying, and to hear that we have to stay with their language a little longer. For nearly 3,000 years, the script of Mesopotamia lay silent. The last readers disappeared. The tablets remained scattered in ruins, reused in walls, lifted from the earth by chance, sold by dealers, shelved in museums, admired as objects long before they were understood as voices. The marks were still there. but the language had fallen away. Entire worlds survived in clay and yet could not speak. Then slowly, the silence began to break. In the early 19th century, scholars started to crack the code of cuneiform. Names came first, royal names, Persian kings, then, over time, Akkadian, and beneath Akkadian, older, still Sumerian, harder stranger, unrelated to the language families scholars knew. A dead language even in antiquity, preserved by later scribes who had studied it the way students study old sacred texts. Piece by piece, through bilingual tablets, lexical lists, copied school exercises, and patient comparison, the language returned. And when it returned, it did not return as a mist of vague religious feeling. It returned with administrative precision. The recovered vocabulary had terms for office rank, legal function, ritual responsibility, social role. The word lugal could be broken down, great man, big man, king. But there were other terms too. An NC was not the same thing. An N was not the same thing. A sukal was not the same thing. The distinctions were exact. Mesopotamian authority was not imagined loosely. It was categorized, differentiated, named. Then there is Nam Lugal, not the king as person, but kingship as office, condition, institution. The abstract form matters, because when the king list says kingship descended from heaven, it is not merely saying that a particular man came from heaven. It is saying that the office itself, the legal and cosmic right to rule, came down from the divine realm into the human one. The statement is technical. It marks origin. It confers legitimacy by locating the institution outside human invention. This is why royal inscriptions across centuries sound so similar. They do not simply boast, "I conquered." They say, "The god called me by name." They say a deity looked upon them with favor. They say the gods gave them rule so that justice would prevail, violence would be restrained, the land would be ordered rightly. Again and again, the king is not self-authorizing. He is appointed, chosen, invested. That pattern deepens when we step into Sumerian theology, because in that world, authority itself could be imagined as transferable. The Sumerian concept of the me sits at the center of this. The Ami are difficult to translate neatly. They are divine decrees, powers, principles, capacities, offices, ordered functions of civilization. But what makes them remarkable is that the texts do not treat them as merely abstract. They can be given, carried, stolen, bestowed. They are both idea and thing, law and object, principle and possession. In the story of Inanna and Enki, Inanna travels to Eridu, where Enki, lord of wisdom and keeper of the deep, holds these powers. They drink. He gives, she receives. Among the me transferred are kingship, priesthood, truth and falsehood, judgment, wisdom, musical arts, warfare, sexual practices, craft, destruction. What matters here is not whether we read the story as myth, allegory, political theology, or memory. What matters is what it assumes about authority. It assumes that civilization is made of transmissible powers. It assumes that these powers are not generated from nothing by human desire. They are held somewhere by someone and must be received. The Tablet of Destinies in later Mesopotamian tradition works similarly. Whoever possesses it can decree. Authority becomes documentary, transferable, sealable, held in a material object that confers power. When the wrong being takes it, the cosmos destabilizes. When it is restored properly, order returns. Again, the same logic appears. Legitimate authority depends not only on possession, but on rightful transfer. If we place these ideas beside the king list, a pattern emerges with uncomfortable consistency. Kingship is not pictured as charisma or force alone. It is pictured as an office that must come from outside the claimant. It must descend. It must be recognized. It must be held according to some order beyond ambition. The ruler does not simply seize power. He must somehow receive it in a way that can be documented, claimed, and crucially believed by the institutions that preserve social life. And then the question returns, because it keeps returning. What exactly did the Sumerians think descended? Was it a ritual status, a body of training, a law, a title, a complex package of authority and knowledge that made rule possible, or something the texts preserve only indirectly through symbols that later readers flattened into myth? The language of the text does not settle easily into modern categories. We want clear boundaries, either literal or symbolic, either historical or imaginary. But the tablets do not always cooperate. They move with another logic. In them, divine authority is at once procedural and sacred legal and cosmic, transferable, and mysterious. It can be received by a city, lodged in a dynasty, born by a ruler, lost through catastrophe, and restored again. This helps explain why genealogies mattered so much. If authority is not self-generated, then lineage becomes evidence. If kingship must be transmitted, then one must show from whom it came. If divine favor attaches to specific lines, then bloodline is not vanity, it is documentation. The scribes note descent carefully. They record divine parentage claims. They identify priestly and royal links. They preserve who married into which sacred office. These are not random embellishments. They function within a system where legitimacy depends on continuity with an original transfer. And it is here, perhaps, that modern readers become most uneasy. Because once we allow the text to mean what it repeatedly says, even if only within its own legal and sacred framework, we are forced to consider that the Sumerians organized power around inheritance in a very specific way. Certain lines were not merely stronger. They were treated as qualified. Certain families were not merely successful. They were recognized as carriers of something that could not be improvised. Perhaps that recognition was political theater. Perhaps it was remembered procedure. Perhaps it was both. But the repetition across text after text does not feel casual. It feels structural. A civilization does not repeat a formula for centuries unless that formula does work. Not only rhetorical work, institutional work. It stabilizes succession. It orders expectation. It marks some claims as valid and others as suspect. So, the more closely we read the words, the stranger they become. Not because they sound mystical, but because they sound exact. Kingship descended. It was given. It moved. It could be restored after disaster. It could be linked to lineages. It could be recognized as present or absent. The grammar is calm. The terminology is technical. The scribes sound less like dreamers than archivists. And once you hear that tone, once you hear how controlled the language is, it becomes harder to pretend the question is merely ornamental. The question is not simply whether the Sumerians believed in gods. Of course they did. The deeper question is what sort of human arrangement they were trying to describe when they said over and over that authority came from above, passed through chosen lines, and could not be manufactured by will alone. To move closer to that, we have to examine the mechanics of selection itself. If kingship descended, then descent implies process. If it moved from heaven to city, from city to ruler, from dynasty to dynasty, then somewhere in the Sumerian imagination, there had to be criteria, a chain, a method, some recognizable way by which one recipient could be distinguished from another. The king list does not explain that method openly. It records outcomes. It says where kingship was and where it went next. But other texts, when placed beside it, begin to illuminate the procedure from the edges. The most revealing is the story of Inanna and Enki. It is often read as political myth, and it certainly functions that way. It explains how Uruk, younger than Eridu, comes to possess powers that once belonged to the older sacred city. But the story is not a battle. It is not a simple act of violent seizure. It is a transaction. There is hospitality. There is drink. There are words spoken aloud. There is witness. There is bestowal. Enki declares that he gives the me to Inanna. She receives them. She carries them away. That is what gives the story its almost legal texture. The transfer is verbalized. It occurs in a recognizable social setting. The gift once given acquires force. Even when Enki regrets it, the act cannot simply be unwound. Inanna's attendants defend the transfer. The powers are brought to Uruk and displayed there. The city possesses them now because the transaction, however contentious its ethics, has been completed. It is difficult not to notice how close this logic stands to ancient law. Witness matters. Declaration matters. Possession matters. What has been properly transferred cannot be dismissed merely because the giver later objects. It is not the language of chaos. It is the language of title. The Tablet of Destinies stories sharpen the same point from another angle. In those accounts, authority can indeed be taken improperly. But when that happens, disorder spreads. Illegitimate possession destabilizes the cosmos. It is not enough to hold the object. One must hold it rightly. The distinction is crucial. Authority is not only material, it is juridical. It has conditions. It demands proper custody. When those conditions are violated, the order that depends on them begins to fail. Now return to the king list with that in mind. When kingship descended from heaven no longer sounds merely like a sacred flourish. It sounds like a statement about valid transfer. The office has been vested. The title has been placed. A city now holds what another does not. A ruler now bears what another cannot claim. Later literature helps fill in the likely criteria. Divine favor appears repeatedly. A god sees a person, calls him by name, loves him, appoints him. Wisdom also appears constantly, especially wisdom associated with Enki, Lord of Understanding. Justice matters. Shepherding capacity matters. The king is often called a shepherd, one who orders and tends human life, rather than merely dominating it. Bloodline matters as well. Descent from earlier legitimate rulers is recorded with care. Ritual roles matter. Marriage into priestly lines matters. Acceptance by temples matters. Then there is the most difficult criterion of all divine parentage. Mesopotamian texts do not always treat divine ancestry as metaphor. Sometimes they record it genealogically, as though it were a meaningful category of descent. Gilgamesh is the most famous example. The tradition identifies him as two-thirds divine and one-third human. However, one chooses to interpret that arithmetic. The important point is not whether we can make it fit modern biology. The important point is that scribes preserved the ratio. They wrote it as if proportion mattered, as if the quantity of divine inheritance could be stated, even measured, and that this had relevance to kingship. That should give us pause. A culture does not casually quantify sanctity. If the scribes preserved such proportions, they likely believed they conveyed something real within their own system. Not perhaps genes in a modern sense, but capacity, qualification degree of participation in divine endowment, some ratio of mortal limitation to received authority. The same pattern echoes through later kings who linked themselves back to Gilgamesh, to Lugalbanda, to Ninsun. The claims are not incidental. They place rulers in a chain reaching toward the beginning, toward those who first held kingship when it descended. Bloodline here is not merely prestige. It is proof of continuity with the original grant. And still the same question returns. What was being transmitted through these lines? Was it simply narrative legitimacy? A story people needed in order to accept rule? Or did the story preserve the memory of something more tangible, something that required training, inheritance, and careful recognition? The texts do not let the question settle easily because they keep speaking in two registers at once: sacred and administrative, mythic and technical, cosmic and legal. Consider the practical implications. A ruler in such a system cannot merely be strong. He must be receivable. He must fit the framework within which authority is recognized as valid. Temples must acknowledge him. Scribes must copy his claim into the record. Priests must integrate his status into ritual life. Subjects must understand him as holding an office that did not originate in his own appetite. The notion of descent from heaven solves that problem. It takes rule out of naked force and embeds it in a long continuity of transfer. This is why the repeated formula matters so much. It is not only an origin story, it is a theory of succession. Kingship was in Eridu, then it was taken to another city, then to another. The wording resembles custody chains. Authority appears almost like a sacred charge moving between institutions. One city holds it for a time, then loses it. Another receives it. The office outlasts the office holder. The institution precedes the person. The person must be fitted into the institution. And once that becomes clear, the pre-flood section of the king list begins to feel less like a decorative preface and more like the deepest part of the title deed. Those first rulers, however strange their reign lengths, stand at the point of first receipt. They are where the line begins. If later dynasties sought legitimacy, then preserving those first names mattered profoundly. The chain had to start somewhere. The descent had to be anchored somewhere. The bloodlines had to reach back to some original moment when rule first arrived in human hands. That is why the old names are preserved with such stillness. Alulim, Alalgar, the kings before the flood, the ones before the reset. The carriers before catastrophe broke the line and required it to be restored. So the mechanics of selection do not emerge from one text alone. They emerge from repetition, from stories of gifts, from anxieties about illegitimate seizure, from genealogies, from divine naming, from priestly appointments, from quantified divinity, from the constant insistence that authority must come from outside and be recognized as such. piece by piece, a system takes shape. And that system leads us inevitably toward the flood, because it is the flood that tests whether kingship was merely human arrangement or something the text believed had to survive disaster itself. Before the flood, the king list says 8 kings ruled in 5 cities. The statement is delivered with the same tone used for everything else. No raised voice, no signal that we have entered a different register, no hint that the scribe suddenly expects us to stop reading administratively and begin reading symbolically. The list simply continues. Eridu first, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shurupak. 8 rulers, vast reigns, then the flood swept over. Modern readers fix on the numbers, and understandably, tens of thousands of years. Reigns measured in spans no ordinary political chronology can absorb. The usual response is immediate myth, exaggeration, symbolic antiquity, and perhaps that is part of it. But even if the numbers are symbolic, they are not random. They fall into patterns, especially in relation to the Sumerian base 60 system. Multiples recur, ratios recur, the figures feel calculated rather than improvised, encoded rather than merely inflated. That does not solve the problem, it deepens it. Because now the question becomes not only why the numbers are impossible, but why the scribes felt compelled to preserve them in ordered form. Why this system? Why these names? Why these 5 cities? Why this exact sequence before catastrophe interrupts the chain? The king list then turns with almost frightening simplicity. The flood swept over. That is all. An abyss in a sentence. A world ended. The chain was broken. And yet after the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. Again. That repeated descent matters. It suggests discontinuity and continuity at once. Something was interrupted. Something had to be restored. But what was restored was not new. It was the same office, the same institution, the same divine charge descending a second time into the human world. Other Mesopotamian texts expand this era, especially the Sumerian flood story, often called the Eridu Genesis. Though the tablet is damaged enough, survives to trace its outline. The gods create humanity to work the land. They establish cities. Not random settlements, but again, the same cities that appear in the king list: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. The overlap is too exact to ignore. Different texts, same geography, same pre-flood world. Then humanity multiplies. Noise rises. The divine assembly decides on destruction. Enlil wills the flood. Enki, lord of wisdom, opposes total annihilation, but cannot simply overturn the decision. So he warns one man indirectly through a reed wall. Build the boat. Preserve life. The chosen survivor in this version is Yusudra, a king, wise and pious. That detail matters more than it first appears to. He is not just a righteous man among many. He is king. He is already the bearer of office. Here the flood becomes more than catastrophe. It becomes a test of continuity. What must survive if civilization is to be rebuilt? Not merely bodies, not only animals, not only seed, the king. The carrier of kingship, the one through whom the line of rule can continue. In later forms of the tradition, he is linked to the last antediluvian ruler named in the king list, whether as identical figure or heir. In either case, the logic is the same. The survivor is not random. He stands at the end of the old chain and at the beginning of the new. This changes the emotional center of the flood story. The biblical Noah is often remembered, above all, for righteousness. In the Sumerian material, righteousness matters, but office matters too. Ziusudra preserves not just flesh, but order, not just family, but the possibility of restored civilization. The boat is not only refuge, it is archive. It is continuity vessel. It carries through the catastrophe what the world after catastrophe will need. And what does the text say happens after survival? Ziusudra is granted life, like a god. Eternal breath. He is removed to Dilmun, the place where the sun rises. Neither fully among ordinary humans, nor simply one more mortal king among others. He becomes a bridge figure, a survivor set apart, a being who spans the old world and the new. That too feels procedural. The one who carries continuity through the flood cannot merely return and dissolve into common life. He has to be marked, elevated, preserved as witness to the break and the restoration. The flood does not erase the pre-flood order entirely. It transmits it through a chosen carrier and then reestablishes it. This is why the antediluvian section of the king list cannot be shrugged off too quickly. Whatever the reign lengths mean, the structure is clear. There was a first age. It had cities. It had kings. It had a chain of succession. A catastrophe interrupted that chain. A survivor preserved the essential seed. Kingship descended again. The post-flood rulers inherited a restored order rather than inventing one from nothing. Perhaps the great numbers are symbolic of duration. Perhaps they encode cycles. Perhaps they compress dynasties. Perhaps they preserve a chronology translated through a system we no longer understand. The text does not explain. But the text does insist. It insists that before the flood, there already existed organized rule city life and a line of chosen rulers. It insists that after the flood, the crucial task was not invention, but restoration. And once we see that another quiet possibility enters the room, the antediluvian kings may matter less as individuals than as vessels of transmission. Their reigns, however, reckon signify not just time, but continuity. They hold the office across an immense span before catastrophe. They preserve something long enough for it to matter. Then the last of them through the flood survivor carries the charge across the break. The king list does not say this directly. It does not need to. The structure says it for them. 8 kings, 5 cities, flood, restoration. The pattern itself becomes argument. What it argues again and again is that civilization does not begin from zero after disaster. It survives because something passes through. A line, a memory, an office, a body of knowledge, a claim to legitimacy, perhaps all of these together. The post-flood world receives what the pre-flood world managed to preserve. And to understand how seriously Mesopotamian tradition took that preservation, we have to follow the flood story into its later versions, where the protocol becomes even clearer and even more unsettling in its precision. In the later Akkadian traditions, the flood expands in scale, but the structure remains strikingly stable. The names shift. Ziusudra becomes Atrahasis in one account, Utnapishtim in another. Details vary, yet the same sequence persists with almost ritual steadiness. Crisis, selection, warning, preservation, survival, verification, elevation. Again and again, the same pattern. Again and again, one chosen human is set apart to carry something through the break. In atrahasis, humanity multiplies, and the noise of human life burdens Enlil. Plague is tried, drought is tried, famine is tried. Each time Enki intervenes through his chosen human, teaching him how to navigate the crisis. Finally, the divine assembly resolves on flood, total destruction. But Enki will not allow the full line to be cut, so again he warns indirectly. Again, a boat must be built. Again, living seed must be preserved. What is preserved in these accounts is never only the biological minimum. Animals are brought aboard, family comes aboard, craftsmen come aboard, supplies come aboard. The implication is difficult to miss. Civilization is not reducible to bare survival. The future requires skill memory practice, ordered labor. A world can lose cities and still keep the seed of city-making. It can lose institutions and still preserve the people and knowledge needed to restore them. The storm lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When it ends, the survivor makes offerings. The gods gather around the smoke. Enlil is furious that anyone remains alive. Enki argues not sentimentally, but almost administratively. Punish proportionally. Use lesser correctives. Do not erase the human race entirely. The logic is exact. Humanity may need reduction, but not total elimination. The system requires preservation. Then the same reward appears once more. Immortality. Removal to a distant place. The flood survivor is no longer fully part of ordinary society. He becomes permanent witness, living evidence that continuity has crossed catastrophe. The Gilgamesh version preserves the same core, framed now as a king's search for eternal life. Gilgamesh travels to the flood survivor because the survivor possesses what no ordinary man possesses: first-hand memory of the break between worlds and the secret of survival beyond it. Utnapishtim tells the story. The boat, the storm, the birds sent out in sequence. Dove, swallow, raven. The waters recede. Sacrifice is made. Enlil relents. He and the survivor's wife are blessed and set apart. Again, the structure is there. And once the structure has repeated often enough, it begins to feel less like free composition and more like protocol. The flood is handled in Mesopotamian memory as a system for safeguarding continuity through destruction. Someone is chosen. Someone is warned. Specific things are preserved. The survivor is elevated and removed. Humanity begins again, but not from emptiness. A later tradition associated with Berossus adds another detail of enormous significance. Before the flood, the survivor is instructed to write down the beginning, middle, and end of all things, and bury the writings in Sippar. After the flood, those writings are to be recovered so that knowledge can be restored. Whether we take this as literal memory, late elaboration, or theological symbolism, the implication remains constant. What matters is not only bodies, but records. Not only lineages, but archives. Not only seed, but knowledge. That is the word that keeps returning beneath the narrative. Preservation. And from preservation, we move naturally to the Apkallu, the sages of pre-flood tradition. These beings, often represented as part fish and part man, emerge from the domain of Enki, the watery deep of wisdom. to teach humans the arts of civilization. Writing, measurement, law, temple forms. The skills that soften life and make cities possible. They are paired in memory with the antediluvian kings. The rulers hold office. The sages transmit understanding. Power and instruction, kingship and wisdom. Two sides of one civilizational inheritance. After the flood, the tradition changes. The Apkallu no longer appear in the same physical way. Their work continues through human successors. That phrase is vital, through human successors. The role does not vanish, it is inherited. The teaching line continues, but now it is institutionalized through mortal carriers. This is the moment where the flood story and the king list begin to merge into a larger theory. If the pre-flood world had kings and sages, and if the flood did not obliterate both lines entirely, then post-flood civilization would depend on the successful transfer of both authority and instruction, kingship, and knowledge. The chosen survivor becomes the bridge not only for bloodline, but for the continuity of teaching. The idea is simple enough to say, and difficult enough to absorb. Civilization survives catastrophe, not because everything survives, but because the right things survive. Enough seed, enough skill, enough memory, enough recognized authority to organize labor again, to rebuild city and temple, to restore order on the far side of ruin. This is why the formula in the king list sounds so deliberate when it repeats after the flood. Kingship descended from heaven. The phrase does not describe innovation, it describes reinstallation. The office is reestablished in the human world because the previous order, though broken, has not been erased without remainder. Something passed through. Something was saved for this very purpose. And if that is so, then the chosen bloodlines of Mesopotamian memory begin to look less like an aristocratic fantasy and more like a solution to a practical problem. How do you preserve complex knowledge and recognized authority across generations, and especially across breaks? You place transmission within families and institutions capable of maintaining long education, long memory, and continuity of ritual and record. You embed succession in bloodline, not because blood is magical in itself, but because lineage stabilizes custody. The flood narratives do not state that in modern terms, but their structure points toward it. The chosen one is chosen because he can carry the seed. The post-flood rulers inherit because kingship is not being invented from scratch. The sages continue through human successors because teaching must remain unbroken. This is where the old question starts to shift. Perhaps the problem is not whether Mesopotamian texts are myth or history. Perhaps the problem is that they are preserving in sacred form a memory of how transmission works under pressure. Catastrophe strips away much. What remains has to be carried by people trained to carry it. And that leads us toward the sages themselves, because if kingship descended from heaven, wisdom seems to have descended with it through figures whose task was not merely to rule, but to teach humans how a world can become a civilization at all. Before humans knew how to write, the tradition says, before they knew how to order, a city, raise a temple, measure the sky, or mark the seasons in lasting form, the sages came from the sea. The first of them is remembered under names that shift across languages, but the function remains constant. He emerges from the waters, associated with Enki, half human and half fish, endowed with reason, and he teaches. Not one skill at a time, not a tentative beginning, but the full package of civilizational arts. letters, sciences, arts, laws, temple building, geometry, agriculture, the ordering of life itself. This is one of the most startling claims in all the Mesopotamian material, and perhaps one of the easiest to flatten. It is tempting to file it away as a culture hero myth and move on. But if we stay with its tone, with the kind of work it is doing, the claim becomes more exact than that. The sages do not simply inspire, they instruct. They establish forms. They lay down procedures. They humanize human life by teaching it how to become ordered. The antediluvian cities of the king list are also the cities associated with these sages. The pattern is too close to ignore. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Sipar, Shurapak. The sages and the earliest kings belong to the same remembered landscape. They are paired in function. One line governs, one line teaches. The king without the sage risks force without method. The sage without the king risks knowledge without institutional form. Together, they make civilization possible. This pattern becomes intensely personal in the figure of Adapa. The texts describe him as a wise man created by Ea by Enki in Eridu. To him, wide understanding was given. The designs of the land were disclosed to him. Wisdom was granted fully. Eternal life was not. That division is one of the deepest hinges in the tradition. Wisdom fully given, immortality withheld. It sounds at first like deprivation. It sounds like tragedy. And indeed, the myth preserves the ache of it. Adapa is summoned to heaven after breaking the wing of the south wind with a curse. There he is offered what turns out to be the food and water of life. But Enki has warned him in advance that they will be food and water of death. Obedient Adapa refuses. The opportunity for immortality is lost. He returns to Earth still mortal. Why? Why would the God of wisdom mislead his own creation? Why give wide understanding and deny eternal life? The story lingers because it feels deliberate. Enki is not a god of careless mistakes. The division must have a purpose, and perhaps the purpose is transmission. If Adapa became immortal, he would leave the ordinary human condition behind. He would belong to another realm. But a mortal sage remains among mortals. He teaches because he must. He knows he will die, and therefore what he knows cannot stay inside him. It has to be passed on. Mortality creates succession. Mortality forces pedagogy. The wisdom survives only if it becomes inheritance. That possibility changes the emotional shape of the myth. What looks like loss becomes design. Adapa is not denied immortality simply to frustrate humanity. He is kept human so that the line of human teachers can begin. He will not solve the problem of mortality. He will solve the problem of preservation. And the Mesopotamian tradition seems to remember exactly that. Before the flood, the sages teach directly. After the flood, their role continues through human successors, through wise men, scribes, priests, advisors, learned families. The supernatural teacher yields to institutional transmission. The living sage becomes school archive temple lineage. This is how knowledge becomes durable. Not by remaining in one perfect being forever, but by entering structures that force repetition. teacher to student, father to son, priestess to novice, senior scribe to apprentice, tablet copied by tablet, until the language itself dies, and yet the text lives on. Once you see that pattern, the emphasis on chosen lines begins to look different. Perhaps the chosen bloodlines were not originally about superiority, but about custody. Certain families had access to training. Certain houses had access to temple libraries. Certain lines could support years of scribal education. Certain children were positioned from birth to receive what the ordinary laborer could not spend decades learning. The result would look from the outside like special qualification, and in practical terms it would be. The Sumerians themselves framed this arrangement theologically. Wisdom came from the gods. Kingship descended from heaven. The sages were sent. The chosen families received, preserved, and transmitted. But even if one translates the framework into more secular language, the structure remains visible. Complex knowledge requires stable channels. Stable channels usually become hereditary unless deliberately widened. In ancient Mesopotamia, heredity and holiness wrapped around each other so tightly they are almost impossible to separate. This brings us toward a figure who stands exactly at that intersection, Enheduanna. Royal daughter, high priestess, author, administrator of sacred knowledge, a post-flood human node in the old transmission system. If the pre-flood sages taught civilization and the flood survivor preserved its seed, then Enheduanna shows us how that inheritance lived in institutions. Not as fish-cloaked beings emerging from the deep now, but as trained human carriers placed deliberately at the junction of bloodline and temple. And this is important because it means the old Mesopotamian idea of chosen lines did not remain abstract. It took form in appointments, in education, in archives, in ritual roles, in a daughter of a king placed where political legitimacy and sacred continuity could be made to meet. So the story narrows from the scale of flood and First Kings to one life, one woman, one carved disc, one name preserved across 4,000 years. And with her, the question of inheritance becomes harder to avoid, because in her case, we can watch it operating almost in the open. In the ruins of a temple complex at Ur, archaeologists found a disc of white calcite small enough to hold large enough to preserve a public image. On it appears a woman in ceremonial dress standing before an altar. Behind her, another figure pours a libation. The inscription names her plainly Enheduanna, High Priestess, daughter of Sargon. The object matters not only because it is old, but because it fixes a role, a title, a placement within an institution. It tells us that this woman stood where bloodline and sacred office met. Enheduanna is remembered as the earliest known author whose name survives attached to her own compositions. But to describe her only as an author would already narrow her too much. She was a royal daughter, deliberately appointed to the highest religious office in Ur, the end priestess of Nana, the moon god. She was not a poet who happened to be noble. She was a convergence point, a chosen daughter in a system built to transmit legitimacy and knowledge together. Her father, Sargon of Akkad, had conquered. That conquest created a problem as much as a triumph. Military success is not the same thing as legitimate kingship in the Mesopotamian frame. To rule the ancient Sumerian cities, Sargon needed more than victory. He needed continuity. He needed his line to be recognized within a structure older than his own rise. Appointing Enheduanna to the sacred office at Ur was part of how that continuity was built. The office mattered deeply. The on-priestess was not a decorative figure. She served as earthly spouse of the city's deity. She mediated between divine and human orders. She stood where ritual, property calendar, cosmic favor, and civic identity met. To place a royal daughter in that role was to marry a dynasty into the sacred architecture of the civilization it sought to govern. And in Enheduanna's case, the move did not remain merely political. She proved capable of bearing the weight. Her surviving texts reveal immense training, literary skill, theological command, ritual knowledge, geographic and institutional understanding of the sacred landscape of Sumer and Akkad. Bloodline gave her access, yes, but access is not competence. The texts show competence. Her exaltation of Inanna is often read for its emotional power, and rightly so. It records a crisis in which she is expelled from office by a usurper. She appeals directly to Inanna. The poem is at once personal lament, political document, theological argument, and liturgical act. The layers matter. Enheduanna does not simply complain. She invokes divine order to reassert rightful office. Her restoration becomes proof that legitimacy has been recognized in the highest court available to her, the goddess herself. That is an extraordinary thing to preserve in writing. It means the poem is not only expression, it is evidence. It demonstrates that a priestess who had been displaced could narrate her displacement appeal through sacred text and emerge restored, thereby validating both her own office and the larger structure that made such restoration meaningful. The divine answer is part of the logic of legitimacy. Her hymns to Inanna deepen the pattern. They catalog the goddess's powers, her many me, her roles as lover-warrior, judge, overturner, restorer. To read them slowly is to sense a mind trained not just in devotion, but in classification. Enheduanna knows how divine power is distributed, how authority is named, how sacred functions interlock. These are not casual praises. They are theological mappings. Most revealing, perhaps, are the temple hymns, the series that moves from one sanctuary to another across Sumer and Akkad. Each temple is identified, praised, and characterized by its specific sacred role. This is not merely beautiful literature. It is inventory in liturgical form. A map of distributed authority. A catalog of where divine powers are housed in the landscape. Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, city after city, temple after temple, each with its own sacred charge. Seen this way, Enheduanna's work becomes almost archival. She is preserving a network. She is documenting where the civilizational inheritance resides. Not all in one place, not all in one family, distributed, structured, held across temples, offices, deities, cities. Her writing gathers those fragments into a coherent, sacred geography. This matters enormously for the question of chosen lines, because here we can see what selection looked like after the flood, after the age of the Apkallu, after the first kings. It looked like education. It looked like placement. It looked like training from childhood literacy in more than one language. Command of ritual forms the ability to supervise institutions and compose authoritative texts. The chosen daughter was not chosen to shine. She was chosen to carry, and carry what memory, procedure, theology, legitimacy, the old inheritance in a human institutional form. The office of royal daughters in priestly roles continued after Enheduanna. It became precedent. Later kings appointed daughters to similar positions because the arrangement worked. It joined royal blood to sacred continuity. It preserved access to temple knowledge within ruling lines. It ensured that political authority and ritual literacy would not drift entirely apart. That continuity is important. It tells us that the civilization had found a way to make the old idea of descent practical. Kingship descended from heaven? Yes. But in lived institutional terms, that descent had to be translated into offices, appointments, educational systems, archives, and lineages. Enheduanna stands at exactly that translation point. The ancient claim becomes embodied in one highly trained woman whose surviving works still testify that the inheritance was real enough to be managed, defended, and passed on. Her position also reveals something else, something quieter. The chosen bloodlines were not merely about men who ruled in public inscriptions. They also depended on women who maintained sacred continuity, who held knowledge within temple systems, who preserved text ritual and memory. Without them, the line would be thinner, the transmission weaker, the legitimacy more fragile. So the inheritance is no longer abstract here. We can almost watch it move. From first kings to flood survivor, from sages to human successors, from conqueror father to priestess daughter, from oral and ritual transmission into signed composition, from one generation to the next through training office and recognized authority. And that brings us back through a different door to Adapa and the larger Mesopotamian conviction that wisdom survives only when mortality compels teaching. Because if Enheduanna was carrying an inheritance, then someone had to give it to her, and someone before them had to preserve it, and someone before them had to refuse to let it die. The story of Adapa becomes heavier the longer one sits with it. At first, it seems like a tale about a lost chance. A human being offered immortality and missing it because he obeyed the wrong instructions. But that reading leaves too much unexplained. It leaves Enki looking foolish or cruel. It leaves the structure of the tradition dangling. Why would the god of wisdom establish the first great human sage only to block his highest ascent? Perhaps because wisdom in the Mesopotamian imagination was never meant to remain sealed inside one immortal figure. Perhaps wisdom had to become inheritance. The line is worth hearing again in slow motion to him. He gave wisdom. Eternal life he did not give. The division is clean, intentional, total in one direction, withheld in another. Wisdom fully granted, immortality firmly denied. Not because wisdom and immortality are unrelated, but because in this system they would interfere with one another. The immortal sage would leave the ordinary human chain. The mortal sage must teach, and once that possibility is allowed, the rest of the evidence begins to arrange itself around it. The sages before the flood teach. The flood survivor preserves. After the flood, wise men continue the line. Fathers instruct sons. Masters train apprentices. Priests and priestesses oversee novices. Scribes copy old tablets under supervision. Kings boast of having learned the scribal arts, mathematics, divination, astronomy. Again and again, knowledge is treated not as spontaneous talent, but as something received through long discipline. The instructions of Shurupak are one example among many. Framed as wisdom passed from an elder to his son, the text moves through practical warnings, moral counsel, judgments about conduct, ways of living in an ordered world. The content matters, but so does the form. The form is transmission. One who knows passes knowledge to one who must preserve it. The emphasis falls not on genius, but on inheritance through teaching. Mesopotamian political thought depends on this. A king cannot rule justly without training. He must know how to hear cases, weigh measures, restrain labor demands, protect temple property, balance, force, and order. This is not instinctive. It is taught. Advice texts to princes make that explicit. If a king does not heed justice, his people fall into chaos. If he listens badly, his land revolts. The warnings assume there is such a thing as proper instruction in rule. They assume kingship is not enough. The bearer of kingship must also learn how to exercise it. This is where bloodline and pedagogy lock together. The prince in a palace, the daughter in a temple, the child of a scribal family in a tablet house. These are not merely privileged by birth. They are privileged by access to time teachers, records, institutions. They can spend years learning what others do not have the luxury to study. The effect is cumulative. Over generations, certain lines become custodians of difficult knowledge, not because nature singled them out, but because society repeatedly placed instruction in their care. Yet the texts still call them chosen. That is significant. Because within the Mesopotamian frame, access alone was not enough. Selection required confirmation. Omens had to support appointments. Ritual offices had to be accepted by the god. Royal claims had to be validated through outcomes. And Hejuana had to prove her standing. Kings had to demonstrate competence. The inheritance was not simply received, it had to be enacted. Assurbanipal's later boast about having learned the craft of the sage Adapa captures this old logic perfectly. He speaks of reading Sumerian and Akkadian, of mathematical complexity, of celestial and terrestrial signs. He claims to have mastered knowledge because he was trained to do so. The line from Adapa to the learned king is not biological in any simple sense. It is educational. It is the continuity of a curriculum so old it has become sacred memory. The great library of Nineveh throws this into relief. Tens of thousands of tablets spanning law, medicine, omen, texts, lexical lists, royal inscriptions, epic ritual astronomy, a deliberate archive, a conscious attempt to gather what civilization must remember if it is to continue. Such a library does not emerge from inspiration alone. It emerges from a culture that has internalized preservation as duty. A culture that knows memory dies unless written, copied, housed, and taught. And that perhaps is the deepest practical meaning of the chosen lines. They are the families and institutions that accept the burden of custody. They train children in dead languages. They copy difficult tablets. They memorize rituals whose immediate purpose may no longer be obvious. They preserve what might seem obsolete because they know that what is obsolete in one generation may be essential in the next. The inheritance survives because someone cares enough to carry forms whose usefulness is not always immediately visible. This is why mortality matters so much in the Adapa myth. Mortal teachers feel time. They know what will vanish if it is not placed in another mind, another hand, another set of practiced fingers pressing signs into clay. Immortality can hoard. Mortality must transmit. So, wisdom becomes a sacred duty precisely because it is fragile. Not fragile in the sense that it is weak, but fragile in the sense that it can be interrupted. Flood conquest fire, neglect, dynastic collapse, linguistic death. Mesopotamian history knew all of these. The answer was not to trust memory alone. The answer was to build lines of preservation strong enough to survive breaks, royal, priestly, scribal, interlocking. And if that sounds less mystical than the phrase kingship descended from heaven, perhaps that is only because we are hearing the infrastructure beneath the vision. The Sumerians gave the process a sacred origin. They said wisdom came from God's office from heaven, legitimacy from divine favor. But in practice, they also built systems by which that sacred inheritance could be carried through ordinary mortal time. That is what allows us, millennia later, to read them at all, not because the knowledge was immortal, because enough mortal people chose to preserve it. And now, with that in mind, we can return to kingship itself, not only as title and myth, but as something that had to be proven, demonstrated, and renewed through visible procedures in the historical world. A conqueror can seize a city in a day. He cannot by force alone persuade a civilization that kingship has truly descended to him. That was the problem faced by rulers again and again in Mesopotamia, and it is what makes their inscriptions so revealing. They are not content with victory. They labor over legitimacy. They know that power without recognition remains unstable, and recognition in this world requires procedure. Ur-Nama understood this. Emerging after the Gutian period and founding the third dynasty of Ur, he did not merely present himself as successful. He presented himself as selected. The language of his inscriptions is careful. The city god looked upon him, called him by name, raised him up so that justice might be established in the land. The phrasing matters because it places his rise inside the old framework. Kingship is not self-made. It is granted. But divine selection alone is not enough. Ur-Nama also had to connect himself to the earlier line of legitimate rulers. He linked his house to older heroic and sacred genealogies. He appointed his daughter to the high priesthood at Ur, repeating the political sacral strategy that had already proven effective. Bloodline temple office continuity with ancient institutions, these were not ornaments. They were supports without which the claim could not stand securely. Then came something else law. His law code, among the earliest known, does more than legislate. It demonstrates, it shows that the ruler who has received kingship can exercise it properly. He standardizes measures. He protects the vulnerable. He restrains abuse. The code becomes proof that kingship has not merely been claimed, but embodied. The office is visible in its effects. That is a crucial point. In Mesopotamian political theology, legitimate authority is not only inherited or bestowed, it is manifested. It produces justice, order, the right relation between ruler-temple land and labor. If a king says he is chosen, and the land dissolves into exploitation and disorder, the claim weakens. If he says he is chosen and equity appears, the claim acquires substance. Shulgi-Ur-Nama's son took this logic and amplified it to an almost overwhelming degree. His hymns present an exhaustive inventory of royal competence. Literacy in Sumerian and Akkadian, mathematics, music, debate, athletics, judicial wisdom, military prowess, ritual propriety. Modern readers sometimes hear vanity in these texts. But another hearing is possible. They are dossiers of qualification. They document that the ruler possesses the capacities appropriate to kingship. Shulgi also claimed connection to divine and heroic ancestry. Again, the pattern. Bloodline is not left vague. It is articulated. Not because genealogy alone is enough, but because genealogy places the king within the older descent of office. He did not invent his title. He inherits a line reaching back toward Gilgamesh and beyond. Late in his reign, Shulgi is even addressed with the divine determinative, deified. That may sound to modern ears like excess, but within the Mesopotamian system, it is the culmination of demonstrated legitimacy. If the king has ruled long and well-restored temples, ordered the land, mastered the arts of kingship, and embodied the powers proper to office, then divinization is less a wild inflation than the formal recognition that he has come to participate fully in the sacred dimension of rule. Yet the system is not sentimental. It does not promise permanence to any dynasty simply because it once received kingship. The collapse of Ur III makes that clear. Under Ibbi-Sin, pressures mount, rebellion spreads, resources thin, roads become unsafe, enemies advance, ritual intensifies, but the empire fails, the city falls, the king is taken, temples burn, catastrophe returns not as cosmic flood now, but as political and military ruin. What then? If kingship had descended from heaven to this line, how could the line fail? Mesopotamian lamentation literature offers the answer with aching clarity. The gods decided. Enlil turned away. The kingship of Ur was made to disappear, yet civilization itself did not end. The people survived. The traditions survived. Kingship moved. Once again, the office outlived the dynasty. Once again, the bearer was conditional, not absolute. This may be the sharpest insight in the whole system. Chosen bloodlines are real within it, but chosenness is not permanent entitlement. It is conditional trust. A line can receive kingship. It can hold it for generations. It can prove worthy through justice and order, and it can still lose it. The institution remains. The office persists. Another line will be raised up. Another city will become the seat. Descent from heaven is renewed through movement. That is why procedures of legitimacy mattered so much. Every new dynasty had to perform the old work. Claim divine selection. Show continuity with prior legitimate rulers, whether by ancestry marriage or carefully constructed genealogy. Join political authority to temple authority. Restore sacred architecture. Demonstrate justice. Produce records. Leave evidence. The institutions that preserved civilization, scribes, temples, archives, cults, schools, had to be able to recognize the claim as valid. And in this recognition, we glimpse again the practical function of chosen lines. They are not simply families with prestige. They are families embedded in networks capable of certifying, teaching, and preserving. A king without those networks remains a conqueror. A king integrated into them becomes ruler in the deeper Mesopotamian sense. The system could be manipulated, certainly. Genealogies could be stretched. Claims could be embroidered. Victors could seize first and legitimate later. But even that proves the point. No one thought raw victory was enough. everyone understood that the office required more than force. It required descent, continuity, recognition, demonstration. So kingship in Mesopotamia appears less as personal possession than as burden. A charge temporarily borne, a sacred administrative office passed along under scrutiny. The chosen line is chosen for a time and must go on choosing generation after generation to preserve the wisdom, justice, and institutional continuity that make the title credible. If that effort fails, the city burns, the dynasty falls, and kingship moves on. And once we have watched it move through flood, sage, priestess, law, deification, and collapse, we are in a position to step back and see the larger patterns the texts keep repeating across centuries. When the tablets are read, one by one, each has its own mood, its own occasion, its own immediate purpose. A king justifying his rule, a poet-priestess invoking a goddess, a flood survivor narrating catastrophe, a sage receiving wisdom, a lawgiver establishing order. But when the tablets are laid beside one another, when the king list stands next to the flood texts, when Adapa is read beside Enheduanna, when royal hymns are heard beside the stories of the me, and the tablet of destinies, patterns begin to emerge. Not loose similarities, not vague echoes. Patterns. The first pattern is the divine origin of authority. Again and again, rule does not begin with human will. Kingship descends. The scepter is given. The ruler is called by name. The office comes from outside the claimant. This remains stable across genres. In myth, in inscription, in historiographic list, in lament, in hymn, the same deep structure holds. The second pattern is pre-catastrophe civilization. Before the flood, there are cities. Before the flood, there are kings. Before the flood, there is already organized human life under recognized authority. However, one reads the chronology, the memory of an earlier order is firm. Civilization is not imagined as beginning after disaster. It is imagined as surviving through it. The third pattern is the chosen survivor, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, different names, same role. One figure is selected, warned, instructed, preserved, elevated. This is not random luck, it is protocol. The chosen one carries continuity across rupture. The fourth pattern is wisdom as gift rather than invention. Adapa receives understanding. The sages teach arts and letters. Kings boast not of inventing justice, but of receiving wisdom to enact it. Knowledge appears as something transmitted whole or in concentrated form, not something each generation rediscovers from the ground. The fifth pattern is mixed or graded divinity. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine. Sages, part fish, part man. Rulers linked genealogically to gods. Priestesses serving as spouses of deities. Whatever we make of the literal claims, the pattern suggests a world that understood qualification for rule and instruction in terms of participation in divine order, not mere human capacity. The sixth pattern is restoration after catastrophe. After the flood, kingship descends again. Civilization is rebuilt. Temples rise again. The line continues. This is not the mythology of total beginning. It is the memory of restoration. The post-catastrophe world sees itself as inheritor. The seventh pattern is preservation through lineages. Royal houses, priestly families, scribal schools, temple archives. Knowledge is not left to drift. It is held in bodies, offices, and institutions. Bloodline and pedagogy cooperate. Children are trained where adults before them were trained. Access becomes continuity. Continuity becomes qualification. The eighth pattern is procedural legitimacy. Proper transfer matters. Witness matters. Gift and inheritance matter. Stolen authority destabilizes. Unproven authority remains suspect. Demonstrated competence validates claims. The institutions of civilization do not simply obey power. They require it to be narrated, documented, and integrated within an older order. Once these patterns are seen together, a coherent picture emerges. Not necessarily a picture we can translate neatly into modern categories, but a picture nonetheless. Mesopotamian civilization understood itself as the custodian of an inheritance older than any one dynasty. It believed that inheritance had divine origin, had passed through catastrophe, and had to be preserved by specific lines trained for that purpose. Kingship and wisdom office and instruction, bloodline and archive, all of them were woven together. Does that prove the literal reality of every claim? No. The patterns do not compel literalism, but they do make it much harder to dismiss the entire corpus as random ideological decoration. The consistency is too strong. The themes recur across centuries, languages, and political contexts. Something durable was being remembered and rearticulated. Perhaps what was being remembered was this civilization depends on transmission. It is not self-sustaining. It can be broken. It can be lost. It survives when some people preserve difficult knowledge, difficult procedures, difficult forms of order, and pass them on under conditions of trust and recognition. The Sumerians rendered that truth in theological language. They said heaven. They said gods. They said descent. They said chosen lines. But beneath those words, there may be a practical insight of startling depth. If the knowledge required for complex society is hard-won, then not everyone will hold it equally. If not everyone holds it equally, then some groups will become custodians. If custodianship persists across generations, it begins to look like chosenness. If the custody includes not only craft, but law, ritual calendar legitimacy, and historical memory, it begins to look like sacred office. And if those who hold it know that disaster is always possible, then preservation becomes not convenience, but duty. This is why the patterns matter. They reveal how an early civilization thought about survival, not biological survival alone, but civilizational survival. How does a city remain a city? How does law remain law? How does astronomical observation outlast the death of observers? How does writing survive the death of a language? How does legitimate rule continue when dynasties fail? The Mesopotamian answer was clear through lines of trained carriers who preserve what came before and transmit it after. The chosen bloodlines then need not be understood first as a claim of superiority. They may be understood first as a claim of responsibility. The line is chosen because it carries, because it remembers, because it knows how to teach, because it has the institutional depth to preserve what catastrophe would otherwise erase. And the longer one lingers over that possibility, the more modern the old tablets begin to feel. We too live by inherited systems. We too depend on archives, schools, libraries, and trained custodians. We too ask, though, in different words, how knowledge survives when worlds change. The Sumerians answered in the language available to them. Their answer was descent custody office transmission. But before bringing that answer forward into the present, we need to face the competing ways these texts can be interpreted, because how we understand the old patterns depends very much on what kind of record we think we are reading. The tablets are there, the excavations are documented, the translations exist. What remains unresolved is interpretation. What did the Sumerians think they were recording when they named antediluvian kings, traced rule through flood, and insisted that kingship descended from heaven? Three broad ways of reading the material present themselves, and each captures part of the truth while struggling with another part. The first is the mainstream academic reading mythology in service of religion and power. In this view, the antediluvian kings are not historical rulers at all, but symbolic figures placed at the beginning of the king list to stretch kingship into primordial time. Their reign lengths are not records, but mythic magnitudes. The flood is either literary memory of destructive local inundation or fully mythologized catastrophe. Divine parentage is propaganda. The sages from the sea are culture heroes. Kingship descended from heaven is theology, not administration. This reading has real strength. It asks for no extraordinary assumptions. It recognizes that ancient rulers everywhere wrapped authority in cosmic language. It treats Mesopotamian texts as cultural documents that reveal belief structure and ideology more than factual history in the modern sense. It guards against reading sacred narrative as journalism. It reminds us that kings needed legitimacy and that myths serve power. And yet, if this reading explains much, it leaves something unsettled. Why the bureaucratic tone? Why preserve mythical material in the same documentary style as later dynasties? Why keep copying these texts for centuries, even after the immediate political utility of specific claims had faded? Why does the language of transfer remain so exact? The pure mythology reading can answer some of this, but not all. It risks flattening a tradition that was more careful with procedure than simple myth often is. The second reading sees the text as encoded wisdom. In this view, the antediluvian world represents an earlier state of human proximity to divine order. The flood becomes catastrophe in a spiritual or civilizational sense. The sages symbolize archetypal teachers. Divine parentage signifies participation in a higher order of consciousness or qualification. Kingship descending from heaven expresses the truth that legitimate rule must align with cosmic principles rather than appetite or force. This reading is attractive because it preserves depth without requiring literalism. It honors the philosophical seriousness of the material. It allows the myths to remain wisdom literature. Under this lens, Adapa becomes the model of mortal wisdom. Gilgamesh's strange arithmetic becomes a way of speaking about mixed human and transcendent capacity. The me become powers of ordered life that must be integrated rightly if civilization is to flourish. And still, this interpretation too has limits. It can become so elegant that it dissolves the concrete. Why then the named cities? Why the exact genealogies? Why the measured reign lengths, however strange? Why the procedural language of gift inheritance and transfer? Pure symbolism rarely works with such administrative detail. The encoded wisdom reading sees the truth in the texts, but sometimes at the cost of their hard edges. The third reading is the most controversial that these texts preserve distorted but genuine historical memory. On this view, there may indeed have been a remembered civilization before some great catastrophe. The flood may encode an actual break. The antediluvian kings may be compressed ancestors, culture founders, or dynastic placeholders remembered through oral tradition. The sages may preserve memory of teacher figures from an earlier order of society. The reign lengths may encode cycles or chronologies now opaque to us. Kingship descended from heaven may reflect the arrival of political forms from outside local memory, experienced as something received rather than invented. This interpretation explains the documentary tone rather well. It explains why mythic and historical material would sit together in the same record without clear separation. It explains why genealogies matter so intensely if continuity of transmission depended on remembered lines. It fits the broader possibility that early civilizations preserved history not as modern critical chronology, but as sacred memory structured around key events and carriers. But this reading also courts danger. It can drift quickly into speculation unsupported by evidence. It can mistake ancient symbolic language for literal reportage. It can overreach, especially when modern readers become eager to discover lost civilizations behind every old text. The caution of scholarship is not meaningless here. We do not know enough to reconstruct confidently what, if anything, lies behind the antediluvian chronology in straightforward historical terms. So, where does that leave us? Perhaps in a synthesis. Perhaps the texts are doing all three things at once. They are certainly theological, they are certainly vehicles of meaning, and they may also preserve historical patterns remembered through sacred framing. It may be that the Sumerians were not inventing out of nothing, nor recording in modern documentary style, but preserving inherited memory in the forms they believed were proper and true. What kind of memory? The memory that civilization is received. That complex order appears to later generations as inheritance, not invention. That some lines preserve and teach what others do not. That authority must be validated by continuity procedure and demonstrated capacity. That catastrophe can interrupt, but need not erase, if enough carriers survive. Seen this way, kingship descended from heaven is both theology and social truth. Not because gods must be imagined handing tablets physically to kings, but because legitimate order always appears to later generations as something that came from before them, from above, them from outside, immediate desire. No child invents writing alone. No ruler invents law from nothing. No civilization begins with a blank slate. Every functioning order descends in a sense. It comes down through tradition, archive, instruction office, and trust. The antediluvian kings then may not require literal reading to remain important. They mark the point where a line imagines its beginning. The flood marks rupture. The survivor marks continuity. The sages mark instruction. The priestess marks institutional custody. The lawgiver marks competent application. The collapse of dynasties marks the conditional nature of holding what one has inherited. The repetition of these patterns across centuries marks the seriousness with which Mesopotamia took the problem of transmission. And perhaps that is the deepest truth available to us. Whether one leans more toward myth, encoded wisdom, or historical memory, the tablets testify to a civilization intensely preoccupied with one question: how is what matters kept alive across time? Their answer was not casual. It was elaborate, reverent, procedural, repetitive, and deeply human. Chosen lines, trained from childhood, confirmed by office, measured by results, charged with memory. That inheritance carried forward into later worlds, into Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, into the Greek historians who heard fragments of these traditions. into us indirectly as readers of their clay. The transmission succeeded at least enough for us to ask these questions at all. And once that is seen, the final movement of the story becomes much quieter. Not flood now, not first kings, not divine sages emerging from the sea, only clay in museum light and the long, patient chain of people who refuse to let the tablets go silent forever. The clay tablets rest now in vaults and drawers in Oxford and Philadelphia and Chicago and Istanbul and London and Paris. Small objects, fired mud, fragments of ancient hands pressed into matter that happened by luck and labor to endure. Empires rose over them, carried them away, cataloged them, forgot them, rediscovered them. Languages died above them. Cities collapsed around them. Yet the marks remained. The prism in Oxford still carries its line. When kingship descended from heaven, then names, then cities, then the flood, then kingship descending again. The object has not changed. Its mass is the same. The clay has not grown heavier, and yet what it bears has crossed 4 millennia. Sumer is gone. Akkad is gone. Babylon and Assyria are gone. The ziggurats are weathered. Temple walls are foundations. Canal systems are dust and scar. But the words remained long enough for other hands to copy them, and long enough for still later hands to decipher them, and long enough for us to hear them once more. That may be the quietest and most important fact in the whole story. Because perhaps the deepest question was never only why certain bloodlines were chosen. Perhaps the deeper question was always this: who carries the inheritance when a generation passes? Who decides that what has been received must not be lost? Who accepts the burden of transmission when there is no guarantee of reward, and every guarantee that time will erase the careless? The Sumerian answer took the form available to Sumer: royal dynasties, priestly lines, scribal families, temple schools, sacred appointments, genealogies, ritual confirmations. The language of heaven descent, divine selection chosen carriers. It was their way of building continuity, their way of identifying those who would preserve what civilization needed in order to continue being civilization. Whether God stood behind that system in the literal way they believed is a question each listener will hold differently. But the function of the system is visible enough. It worked, not perfectly. Dynasties failed, libraries burned, texts vanished, languages died, catastrophe still came, and yet enough survived. Enough was copied, enough was taught, enough was buried and recovered and recopied and reinterpreted that the inheritance continued. Some families failed their charge. Some rulers held kingship badly. Some lines broke. The system was never pure. No human system is. But the chain did not vanish. New carriers appeared. New dynasties absorbed old forms. New scribes studied dead languages because they knew dead languages still held living knowledge. New priestesses entered old temples. New kings restored older sanctuaries. Again and again, in different forms someone chose to carry. Perhaps that is the real meaning of chosenness once the dust settles. Not superiority, not magic blood, not exemption from mortality. Responsibility accepted, responsibility preserved. The chosen are the ones who do not let the inheritance die. The Sumerians framed that in the language of descent from heaven. And perhaps that language still has force even now. Because every true inheritance does descend in a sense. It comes to us from before our own willing. None of us invents the whole of what sustains us. We receive language law, memory calculation, story ritual, and craft from the dead. The question is never whether we begin from inheritance. We do. The question is whether we pass it on. That is why the old texts feel less remote than they first seem. We too build institutions to preserve memory. Libraries, schools, archives, universities, museums, digitization projects, editorial traditions, different forms, same anxiety. Will this survive us? Will the next generation care enough to preserve what we have received? Will someone still read? Will someone still copy? Will someone still translate? The difficult line in the dead language, and feel the old question stir again. In that sense, the bloodlines are no longer only biological, if they ever were. They are pedagogical. They are lines of teaching, lines of stewardship, lines of custody. The graduate student bent over cuneiform signs, the curator stabilizing a fragile fragment, the teacher assigning a translation, the reader who carries an old thought carefully into a new mind. The inheritance continues because someone somewhere keeps choosing not to let it end. And so the prism in Oxford is not merely a relic of a lost civilization, it is proof of transmission. It made it here because scribes copied, because readers preserved, because excavators recognized, because museums housed, because scholars deciphered, because language, though lost, was not lost forever. The line held, broken in places, yes, but held. That may be why the closing mood of the old Sumerian question is not really dramatic. It is quiet. The clay does not shout. The tablets wait. They wait for the next reader, the next generation, the next act of carrying. Their lesson is not only that kings once claimed heaven. Their lesson is that civilization survives by repeated acts of patient custody. So, wherever you are hearing this late at night, perhaps, or in the first dim light before morning, let the old question return one last time, because it is still the same question. Not only why were certain lines chosen long ago, but who will choose now to preserve what has been handed down? Who will remember that knowledge can be lost? Who will refuse that loss? Who will carry the weight without applause, as scribes did, as priestesses did, as teachers did, as archivists and readers still do? The Sumerians gave one answer. Generation after generation, someone always carries, through flood and fire, through dynastic collapse, through the death of languages, through the scattering of tablets across empires. Someone copies, someone teaches, someone remembers, someone receives the weight and does not set it down. The inheritance continues that way, quietly, almost invisibly, not secure forever, never secure forever, but secure for now, because hands continue to lift it, because minds continue to study it, because responsibility once accepted becomes its own kind of lineage. And perhaps that is finally what it means to be chosen. Not destiny imposed from above in some theatrical moment, but the human decision repeated again and again to preserve what would otherwise vanish, to bear the fragile, precious burden of memory. to let civilization outlive the bodies that serve it. The clay tablets rest in their vaults. The old words remain in them. The next reader will come. The next generation will come, as it always has, as it always must. The questions can settle now. The inheritance for the moment is still here.